Welcome back to the Stone Rain Magic the Gathering channel. Here I have the second video in order, um, but perhaps the most important video on the channel. Uh, Today I'm going to try and give you a concise yet comprehensive introduction to Magic the Gathering. We'll talk about the game itself, we'll talk about the cards, we'll talk about how to play it, and a lot more. So, like I said, the first thing we're going to dive into is those card types. We're going to look at gameplay, we'll look at the different formats in which people play Magic the Gathering, and then I'll briefly touch on what your next steps might be if you are indeed looking to continue your foray into Magic the Gathering. So, without further ado, we have to ask, what is Magic the Gathering? Now, it is, at the end of the day, a trading card game. At its very core, there are five different colors: white, blue, black, red, and green. You'll see there are five different basic lands that are represented here. On top, you have the older cards, the older basic lands that we had. And on the bottom, you have some nice, fresh, beautiful looking lands. These are some of my favorites from the last couple few years. Bowl of Island is a little bit older, but that's from maybe a 6, 7, 8 years ago. That's always going to be one of my favorites. But you can see that cards have evolved in how they've been printed. First off, all the white bordered cards you see are going to definitely tell you that it's an older card. But you can look right in the middle at that swamp on top. The whole instruction is written out. To the right of that, the mountain and the forest, you can see the kind of diagonal T in a circle. And then to the left, the plains and islands actually have that tap symbol on them. Whereas on the bottom, they've gotten rid of all the reminder text. We don't care about the reminder text anymore for whatever reason. There are some times where we get a good amount of reminder text, but we're just going to print full art lands now. When we see that it's a mountain or a forest, we know that it makes red or green mana respectively. So they just got rid of all that text on the lands and said, let's go. Um, but these lands represent the five different colors of mana, but there's not just five basic lands. We do also have some colorless cards. That is a big part of Magic the Gathering. We'll see a lot of colorless cards as I talk through some of the different things here. Um, there's not too many cards in Magic that require you to make colorless mana, but it's something to be aware of. Anyway, I also love this wastes. It's a beautiful art as well. So there has also been, like I said, an evolution of cards. You can see this grizzly bears. It's one of the more generic creatures that's been printed in Magic the Gathering, and it's been reprinted quite a bit. You can see this first iteration actually has the word summon creature, which I think at the beginning of the game was very important because it it is the at the end of the day the gameplay is two wizards kind of dueling it out, and these creatures that you play, that you cast, um, you're summoning them to your side to help you out, and you have to use your resources to do that. So you can see the grizzly bears. We've got the name on the top left. On the top right, we see a 1 in a circle. That is a 1 generic mana symbol, and then a green mana symbol on the top right. that tells me that I need to pay 1 mana of any color and then 1 green mana in order to bring him onto the battlefield, um, to summon him, like it says on there, summon creature, and then it gives me the power and toughness of the creature on the bottom right. So then we go into newer printings. They've gotten rid of the word summon. They give you actually creature types as we go further, and they got rid of those little symbols, which I think are pretty cool. But we know that the one on the left is going to be an attack. The one on the right is going to be its toughness. So the cards have evolved over time, and with that, uh, the game has become not just a card game, but a very collectible game. You can see some of the original cards, like Black Lotus, go for tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Um, the original cards that they printed were a little bit off scale, so that's why some of them are also worth a lot. Black Lotus is one of those cards that's in the Power 9, is what we call it, the kind of most powerful 9 cards of the original printing of Magic the Gathering. Um, but we see some really cool evolutions over the last years. Some people, not me, in the Magic the Gathering community are not thrilled with the evolution, but we have all these crossover sets now, and they're really expanding the Magic the Gathering universe, bringing in characters like Optimus Prime, Frodo Baggins, even Wesley, from Princess Bride. So there's really a catering of the game to all sorts of audiences. It's really interesting to see, but you're really getting a lot more of just really pristine, beautiful card design, as far as the art goes, as far as the cards go. I think the Lord of the Rings set was a great example of just how much they can do when they sit down to design a set. And I really like the idea that we're incorporating other franchises, other trademarks into Magic the Gathering. It has really opened it up. So before I go too much more into that, I think we need to take a step back and look at the card types. This is going to be a fundamental part of playing the game. So I think these next pieces of the video are very important. First off, I touched on lands. We looked at the basic lands. Most decks are going to use mostly basic lands, the plains, the islands, the swamps. But there are quite a few really interesting lands that have been printed over Magic the Gathering's history. The first of which we have the original dual lands, as they are called. So Tropical Island is one of those, and it is both a forest and an island. It can tap for either green or blue mana. Tapping is just the way we designate in Magic that resource is used up for the turn. So it can tap for either green or blue mana. Now, those are incredibly powerful because they come into play untapped, aka just ready to use. So over time, as they've printed more dual lands, lands that can tap for 2 colors, they have ones like Radiant Grove on bottom, which come into play tapped, so they can't be used the first turn, a little bit of a drawback, or like Blood Crypt, where you have to pay life or meet a certain condition to have them come into play untapped and ready to use. So there are plenty of different dual lands. There are also other ways because when you're building decks, you like to have access to more than one color usually. So we have things called fetch lands. is what we like to call these. Evolving Wilds is a fetch land for basic lands for those islands, plains, swamps, forests, and mountains. Polluted Delta is a really interesting one. You see, you have to pay a life in order to use the Polluted Delta, but it's going to let you get any kind of island or swamp, not just a basic one, but I can actually use my Polluted Delta to go find a Blood Crypt from my deck and put it onto the battlefield, or even a tropical island, right? So these fetch lands are really nice because they help you to incorporate more colors into your deck, and they are going to also what we call thin your deck. They're going to essentially help you get an extra land out of your deck onto the battlefield. So now I have a lesser chance of drawing lands later in the game, which is maybe a more advanced tactic, but they are nevertheless very important cards, these fetch lands. We also have ones that tap for all sorts of mana. The Mana Confluence is one of the consummate examples of this. So you can see this Mana Confluence, you do have the downside of paying a life each time you use it, but it can tap for 1 mana of any color. So that one's not a forest or an island or anything like that. It's just a land, but it can tap for any mana at any time. So it's a very cool one. Finally, we have what we call utility lands. So utility lands oftentimes will tap for colorless mana, so they won't really help you other than to pay the generic mana costs, but they might have some other sort of ability that can be really useful. Sometimes you can use them to sacrifice creatures or do other things that are kind of a strange thing to be able to do with a land. So that's utility lands. You see all the sorts of different lands that exist in the game. Why are lands so important? The most restrictive part of Magic the Gathering is that you can only play 1 land per turn. You're going to start off casting small spells with 1 or 2 or 3 mana cost, and then you're going to hope that you can keep dropping a land every turn so that you can play your 5 and 6 and 7 cost spells to eventually overwhelm your opponent and win the game. So these lands are vitally important. If you don't have lands on the battlefield, you're not going to be able to play your other cards. So this is a foundational part of the game. And again, only 1 land per turn. So you got to hope that you keep drawing your lands, or else you might not be able to keep up with your opponent. So what am I going to do with my lands? I'm going to start off by going through all the other permanents. Those are the cards that are going to stay on the battlefield forever. We'll go through all the permanents, and then we'll move on to sorceries and instants at the very end. But we'll start here with creatures, because at the very end of the day, the easiest way to win Magic the Gathering is to kill your opponent by reducing their life points to 0. In most formats, you're going to start with 20 life. There are some formats where you start with more, but 20 is usually the standard. So here's a very simple, straightforward creature. We saw that Grizzly Bears earlier. Here's a Raging Goblin. So this is a red card. That red mana symbol in the top right tells me it's only 1 mana to play. It does have to be a red source, so whether that's a mountain or some other land that can tap for red mana. And for that 1 red mana, I'm going to get a 1 attack, 1 toughness creature. And this Raging Goblin actually has, the way it's written here is unaffected by Summoning Sickness. We have errata that. Errata is the word we use to say kind of change the text or made the text uniform to the way the game works nowadays. Um, so the text has been changed to say haste. Haste is the key word that we use for this sentence that we have on Raging Goblin here. So what does that mean? It means it's going to be able to come in and immediately attack. Most creatures are going to come in with summoning sickness, so they won't be able to attack on that first turn. They're just going to be able to sit there. They will be able to block, but they won't be able to attack. Now, that's important because I can immediately get after my opponent with this Raging Goblin. On turn one, I play a mountain. I play my Raging Goblin by tapping the mountain for 1 red mana, and then bam, I'm tapping the Goblin to denote that that kind of resource is used up for this turn and going straight after him. And now my opponent's going from 20 to 19 life. So fundamental way of winning the game, put creatures on the board, have more creatures or bigger creatures than your opponent, keep attacking them until they die. So what's happened over time is we get bigger and bigger or more daunting creatures even. So you can see there are some absolute mammoths now. This Emrakul is actually banned in a lot of formats. It's a card that was printed and then after it was played in a couple different formats, people said, this might be too good. So you can see there's a whole bunch of text on this card. It's 15 mana, which is an insane amount of mana. Most games you will not ever get to 15 mana. But Emrakul says if you get to 15 mana, you're going to basically win the game. Um, it can't be countered. You get an extra turn. It has all sorts of text on it that's saying basically, if I get this out, I'm going to win. But yeah, so a 1-1 for 1 is great. But if I only have a couple 1-1s and somebody drops a 15-15, I'm probably not going to win. You can also see there are other creatures. This Atraxa is one of the infamous creatures in some circles as well, especially Commander. It is a 4 mana 4/4, though it does require 1 green, 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 black to play. So it's very restrictive in that sense. You need to be able to make 4 different colors of mana in order to play it. But again, word soup, just for 4 mana. It has 4 different keywords and another ability on top of it. This is a very threatening creature for 4 mana. And that's what's happened over time is that Magic has gotten this sort of power creep where we've had this game exist for 30 years and as they push out usually somewhere between 3 and 6 sets of cards, usually 200 cards per set, we get these really powerful creatures, really powerful spells. So they just keep going and keep going. So that's creatures. Again, the easiest way to win these games is going to be playing creatures and then swinging, attacking your opponent. We call it swinging, right? Because we're tapping the creatures, but attacking your opponent with the creatures and reducing their health to 0. Now, the next one that we'll look at is artifacts. Another permanent, another kind of card that's going to come out onto the battlefield and stay there until it's destroyed or until you win the game. So this Sol Ring is, again, another kind of very famous card, especially I play a lot of commander we'll get into later. But Sol Ring is an artifact for 1 generic mana, so 1 mana of any color, and it comes in, sits there as an artifact. It doesn't have summoning sickness, so it can be used right away, and you need to tap it, so using it up for that turn, to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. That's an effect that we call ramp in Magic the Gathering. Like I said, we only can play 1 land per turn, so if now I can play a spell that somehow gives me access to more mana that I can use every turn, I'm going to be able to play better and better spells even quicker than my opponent. So mana ramp is a very, very good strategy as far as getting big things out quick and beating your opponent. This Sol Ring is one of the absolute best ways to do that. But yeah, so artifacts are going to be permanents that are more so utility than creatures are. They might not directly win you the game at all. The Sol Ring can't win you the game by itself, but like I said, it can help you cast other bigger things very quickly, which will help you win the game. So another kind of utility piece is a card like Unwinding Clock. This is going to let you untap all your artifacts during each other player's untap step. So on everybody's turn, you're going to untap all your stuff. That means a card like Sol Ring will untap during every opponent's turn, which means that I have kind of an extra 2 mana to use during everybody's turn. So that is a consummate utility piece. It's just coming in and probably helping a specific strategy. It might not be good in a creature deck, but it's very good in an artifact deck. The Great Henge is another kind of utility piece. It is kind of a marriage between these first 2 cards, the Unwinding Clock and the Sol Ring, because like the Sol Ring, it does tap for mana itself, but it also has another utility effect. The +1/+1 counter can be helpful, but the biggest thing is it's now going to let you draw a card every time you play a non-token creature, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control. So now you're going to be able to get more cards from your deck, so you'll have more resources to play with as you go through the game. Then we have a couple other sort of utility ones. I wanted to showcase Sword of the Meek as an equipment. These artifact equipments are ways to kind of just better a creature that you have on the battlefield. So the equip for 2, I can spend 2 additional mana to now put it on one of my creatures. So if I have my Raging Goblin and I give it a Sword of the Meek, it's going to be a goblin with a sword, basically. So instead of just that 1/1 goblin, it's now going to get a little stat boost from the sword. Then you have another utility piece underneath it, this Thopter Foundry. For those of you who are more advanced at Magic the Gathering, you might recognize that combo. This is an example of 2 cards that work together very well, because the Thopter Foundry is a sacrifice outlet. So it's going to let me sacrifice a non-token artifact, like my Sword of the Meek, for 1 mana, and it's going to make a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature, and I gain a life. So without getting too much into the combo, because that might be overwhelming to start with, there's just so many different things you can do with these utility pieces, and you start to see that because there are so many cards in Magic, cards that get printed sometimes have really interesting sort of combinations with cards that have already existed, and that's the case here with Sword of the Meek and Thopter Foundry. The next one I want to look at is what are called vehicles. So another kind of subtype of artifact are these vehicles, which are essentially dormant creatures, is the way I would look at it. They are able to attack, but only after you crew them. You put a certain amount of power of creatures to drive them, I guess. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. So if I have 2 grizzly bears on the battlefield, 2 2/2s, 2 power, 2 toughness creatures, I can tap both of those grizzly bears in order to crew my Parhelion, which turns it into a creature until the end of my turn, and now I can attack with it. So this is kind of the intermediary between artifact and creature, and you'll actually see here with Solemn Simulacrum and other such artifact creatures, we can have 2 different card types come together. So a Solemn Simulacrum counts both as an artifact and a creature. Again, these are just 2 types of permanent. Yeah, so we'll see that sometimes these card types do kind of combine together. We can even have a creature that's a land. But we won't go into that. But here we have Solemn Simulacrum rounding out the display of artifacts. We'll go into enchantments. The other sort of kind of parallel to artifacts, enchantments are again things that are going to sit on the battlefield. A lot of times they are just going to be utility in some sort of way. Enchantments do differ a little bit from artifacts. Most of the artifacts originally were colorless cards. Most of the enchantments had a color. You can see that's changed over time. But the kind of simple way of looking at it is the two are very, very similar. You just see that there are different cards in Magic that synergize better with artifacts or synergize better with enchantments. So it's just essentially 2 sides of the same coin. They're just permanents. They're just going to be on the battlefield helping you out in some way. So this one, Concordant Crossroads, is kind of an interesting one. It helps out your creatures, yes, but it helps out everybody's creatures. So it's going to give all those creatures haste. It's going to let everybody tap and attack with their creatures right away. It's a very fun card and has been around Magic for a very long time. Some of the other enchantments that I have here are Smothering Tithe and Rhystic Study. These are what we so lovingly or saltily refer to as stacks pieces. In Magic the Gathering, one of the strategies is to essentially make it harder for your opponent to play their strategy. So Smothering Tithe and Rhystic Study are ways that we can tax our opponents to do a thing. So Smothering Tithe says if you want to draw a card, you have to pay 2 mana or else I'm going to get a little thing. Rhystic Study says if you want to cast a spell, you have to pay an extra 1 mana or else I'm going to get another card. So these are cards that by themselves are not going to do anything until our opponent acts. And when they take their turn and draw a card, if they don't pay the 2, then we're going to get a little bonus, a little treasure token that makes some mana. The other one I want to look at This is called a saga. It's a relatively newer kind of enchantment. It's going to come down with a counter on it, and then at the beginning of each of your turns, it's going to get another counter, and it is just, as it says, a saga. It's going to have different effects happen successively, and then boom, we're going to unfortunately have to get rid of it at the end, but it'll stay on the battlefield until its effects are done. Then we have what are called auras, or enchant creatures, was the original text here. So we have things that we can put on our opponent's creatures, like pacifism, which means that our opponent's creatures are no longer going to be able to block or attack in pacifism's case. And then you can read Pemin's aura. It's a famous combo piece, but you have to pay extra mana in to do any of its abilities, but its abilities are going to help you potentially win the game. So it can turn a creature into a very useful one. Um, then we have other ones. This Mirari's Wake is more along the lines of Concordant Crossroad. It's essentially just going to sit there, but it's going to give your creatures a boost. They're going to get one more attack and one more toughness just at a passive level. And then passively, every time you tap one of your lands, you're going to get an extra mana produced from that land. So some of these enchantments are, again, coming into Magic, you might think, well, it's not a creature, it's not attacking, it's not going to do much. There are plenty of enchantments that are really going to change the way you're playing the game or give you just a very, very big benefit, and are why a lot of these cards will get played. Finally, just like artifacts, we do have some enchantment creatures. Again, this is more of a recent update to Magic the Gathering. Artifact creatures had been around for longer. Enchantment creatures are relatively newer. I do have a deck built around this Goshintai card. The Shrines archetype was a very interesting one to me, so when it came out, I was all about building it. It was a lot of fun. Next, we'll move into a different kind of permanent. Um, I'm not going to spend too much time on battles, only to give you an idea of what they do, because I do think they also introduce the next one very well. We only have one set of Magic card with battles in the first place. So what these cards do is you play them for their mana cost on the front side. So this Invasion of Fiora costs 4 generic and 2 black mana, 6 mana altogether. And it comes onto the battlefield. You get to either destroy all legendary creatures or all non-legendary creatures, or you can choose both. You're going to have it enter essentially attached to or being protected by, I think is the better way to say it. So one of your opponents is going to have to protect it. So that 4 in the bottom right is essentially like its life. It's going to have 4 counters on it. Every time you do 1 point of damage, you can remove that counter. If you have something that does 4 damage to it, you remove all 4, and it flips over, it removes itself from the battlefield and then comes back flipped over as this creature. So it's a very interesting form of card. Again, it's only been in one set though, but that 4 damage that it can take is a good precursor to our planeswalkers. Now, planeswalkers are also, in the grand scheme of Magic, a more recent sort of thing. But what's interesting is they have also kind of been Magic the Gathering Wizards of the Coast has chosen to go away from them because they are such a powerful card. And they were kind of dominating the game in a lot of different ways. So these 5 here are some of the 5 original Planeswalkers. We have Ajani in white, Jace in blue, Liliana in black, Chandra in red, and Garruk in green. And these were some of the 5 just kind of original Planeswalkers. What these cards do, again, you play them for their mana cost. So Ajani would be 2 generic and 2 white, 4 mana altogether. And they come in with that number on the bottom right, that 4 loyalty. What you do is you're going to have to protect them. When your opponent attacks with creatures, he can choose to attack you, or he can choose to attack your planeswalker once you have a planeswalker on the battlefield. So they're kind of like life points, whereas your creatures will heal at the end of every turn, your planeswalkers will not. But you also have the 3 different abilities that you can see listed on each of these planeswalkers called loyalty abilities. Some of them will add loyalty, some of them will subtract loyalty. One of the interesting things is you do need to have that much loyalty in order to use the effect. So I can play Chandra, for example. It'll come in with 6 loyalty. I won't be able to use that -8. I would need to get it up to 8 loyalty before I could use its -8 ability. But I could use the middle ability, and I can choose any number between 1 and 6. I can do a -5 to deal 5 damage to target creature, for example. So you have to have the loyalty in order to spend it, but you can also, again, add loyalty, and you do one of the abilities each turn. So they are a very interesting kind of wrinkle to the game of Magic, usually, again, very powerful. So that is one of the reasons why Wizards of the Coast has chosen to move away from them. Now we're through the different permanents. The next 2 we're going to see are sorceries and instants. I started here with sorceries because there's a very simple distinction between sorceries and instants. Sorceries you can only cast on your turn. So you can see some examples here like Rampant Growth, which is going to, again, ramp. It's going to let you get an extra land from your library onto the battlefield. So it's going to help you get access to more mana and play better spells quicker. And then you have things like Divination, which allow you to draw extra cards, Time Warp to take extra turns, Extinction Event to get rid of a bunch of stuff on the battlefield, a bunch of creatures specifically, Vandal Blast to get rid of artifacts. And then you'll see I wanted to keep a couple high mana cost sorceries here. Genesis Ultimatum and Finale of Devastation are 2 examples of sorceries that can just by themselves almost win you the game. Now, sorceries are usually sorcery speed, is what we call it, only able to be played on your turn because of their power level, right? Being able to do something like Genesis Ultimatum on your turn, very, very good. Being able to do it on someone else's turn, definitely not fair. So there are the instants as well, which we'll see are things you can do at any time during the game, which is by itself a very, very powerful thing. So a lot of these sorceries, as they're designing the cards for each set, They're looking at these spells and saying, should I be able to play it on my opponent's turn or no? That's kind of the major consideration they have to make. So again, sorceries only during your turn. And now we look at instants, which can be played at any point in time. The two kind of most thought of instants are right here, Counterspell and Lightning Bolt. Now, um, one of the things that makes Magic the Gathering, one of the reasons why it's considered to be such a difficult and complex game is because of the interaction that instants allow. Um, you think of trap cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or different things like that, but those have very specific sorts of conditions in order to work, right? So instants, no condition needs to be met other than that you have the mana available to play them. So Counterspell, for 2 blue mana, you are going to stop your opponent from playing whatever spell they were just trying to play. It's a very, very powerful sort of thing, because if I'm trying to play something that costs 6 mana, might win me the game, I've tapped all my lands in order to make that mana. I go to cast my spell, and you counter it, means that now all of my resources are used up. That spell goes straight to the graveyard and it is unusable for the rest of the game for me. So it's a very powerful effect. The idea of Lightning Bolt sticking around and being so powerful after all this time is because that 1 red mana for 3 damage is a very sizable amount. So that one has stuck around over time. Some of the other kind of most famous 1 mana instants, Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, 2 of the greatest removal spells that white has. You're just going to get rid of a card permanently from the game, with a little bit of downside, right? Whether it's gaining life or getting an extra land to play. But this is a very powerful effect for 1 mana. You have something like Fatal Push, can destroy a good creature, but again, there are conditions there. So no conditions to Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile, just a little bit of a downside. Finally, we see something like Giant Growth, which is going to allow a creature to get bigger. This is a pump spell, is what we call that, until end of turn. So it's going to give a little stat bonus. And then we do have some really powerful instants. Cyclonic Rift is a good example of a bounce spell, but just like Vandal Blast has that overload clause, Cyclonic Rift does as well. You can get rid of all of somebody's non-land permanents just back to their hand during their turn, which is an absolutely overwhelming effect. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to split this up. I did not expect the video to be this long. So thank you for watching part 1. In part 2, I will move on to gameplay and we'll take it from there.